Coming up, the Cowboys and Eagles establish themselves atop the NFC as the 49ers lose Jimmy G for the season. This is Locked On Game to Game NFL.
Every game, every team, every angle. Locked On Game to Game, your team every day.
Welcome in. You're listening to Locked On Game to Game NFL, local experts taking you from game to game in week 13 of the NFL season. I'm your host, Kainani Stevens. Thank you so much for making Locked On your first listen every weekday. Primetime Sunday Night Football seemed competitive for a while until Dallas blew the doors off in the fourth quarter with 5 touchdowns in the final 15 minutes. Locked On Cowboys and Locked On Colts go over that beatdown in Dallas.
Going into the fourth quarter, the Dallas Cowboys were only up 2 against the Indianapolis Colts at home. So what happened then? Hi, I'm Landon McCool with the Locked On Cowboys podcast, and the Dallas Cowboys defeat the Indianapolis Colts 54-19 after a 33-point fourth quarter by the Dallas Cowboys, the most points by the Dallas Cowboys in any single quarter in history of the franchise, and 1 point short of the NFL lead in the history of points scored in a single quarter. The Cowboys played with their food entirely too long in this game. They didn't their quarterback Dak Prescott did not have a really great game early on. Struggled to get the ball out, had 1 interception, and maybe 2 other plays that probably could have been interceptions, but then the second half started. The Cowboys were able to kind of find their footing a little bit, pull ahead, try to gain a lead finally by 2 points. And then the fourth quarter came, and the Cowboys absolutely started tearing the Colts apart. Multiple turnovers by the Colts that were converted by the Cowboys into touchdowns, whether by the defense themselves or by the Cowboys offense, ended up in an absolute routing as they scored 33 unanswered points to end this game and to walk away with an enormous victory. As they head into the next week where they face the hapless Houston Texans, the Cowboys are still trying to keep pace with the Philadelphia Eagles for a chance to steal away the NFC East title. For more on the Dallas Cowboys, make sure you check us out on the Locked On Cowboys podcast. And for more on your team, make sure you check out them on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
The Indianapolis Colts were absolutely demolished on Sunday Night Football by the Dallas Cowboys. They fall 54-19 on prime time. This is Zach Hicks of Locked On Colts podcast, and we didn't expect this game to be very close. The Dallas Cowboys are obviously on just a different level than this Indianapolis Colts team, but nobody could have predicted this much of a lopsided score. The Colts kept it close going into the fourth quarter. It was 21-19 at one point, but then the Cowboys went on a 33-0 run in that fourth quarter. That was capped off by the Colts offense turning the ball over on 4 straight possessions. There's not many words to be said about this game. The Colts are just a bad team right now, and the Dallas Cowboys really embarrassed them in prime time. So we'll see how Jim Irsay and the Colts organization responds to this thorough beatdown in prime time. But yeah, we'll have much more on this, in this upcoming week with the bye week coming up. Check us out every Monday through Friday. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Another NFC East team with a dominant win on Sunday were the Philadelphia Eagles. They topped the Titans, and A.J. Brown got some revenge against his old team. Locked On Eagles has more on the stars of the game.
The Philadelphia Eagles are 11-1 after a 35-10 victory over the Tennessee Titans. I'm Louis DiBiase, host of the Locked On Eagles podcast. There's a lot of reasons for this victory, but the key was the passing game through Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, and Devontae Smith. 1 week after the Eagles had 363 rushing yards, the most they've had since the 1940s. The Eagles show why they are a Super Bowl team, why they are different than other elite running teams like their opponent, the Tennessee Titans. When they want to, they can also be a top-tier passing attack. Numbers for you in this game. Jalen Hurts, 380 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. He is the first Eagles quarterback ever with over 370 passing yards, 3+ passing touchdowns, and at least 1 rushing touchdown. How about A.J. Brown as well? The revenge game against Tennessee. He leads the way, 8 catches for 119 yards and 2 touchdowns. Devontae Smith, 5 catches for 102 and a score. Pro Football Focus said before this game, the Eagles were one of 2 offenses this year with an 80+ passing and running grade. Well, that continued today. That's the difference. That's why this Eagles team is 11-1, and they're the best in football. They can do it all led by their MVP caliber quarterback. The Eagles take it 35-10 over the Tennessee Titans. I'm Louis DiBiase, host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Jacksonville's season-long struggle with consistency continued as they got blown out by the Lions on Sunday. Locked On Jags pulling no punches after a terrible loss.
The Jacksonville Jaguars played their worst game of the season at the wrong time. I'm Tony Wiggins with Locked On Jaguars, your daily Jacksonville Jaguars podcast, where it's your team every day. They were awful. They were terrible. It's the worst game they played all season. And they made Jared Goff look like Joe Montana, fumbling the ball, Travis Etienne early in the game, dropping the ball, Zay Jones all day, the defense that could not get a pass rush. This team has a long, long way to go. They came out extra flat. They almost played like they were mad at each other for some reason. Trevor Lawrence was able to avoid a serious injury right before halftime, but it just wasn't enough that he came back into the game. They lose 40-14 to the Detroit Lions, and things don't look good.
The Falcons lose a winnable game against the Steelers at home yesterday. Locked On Falcons says it may finally be Desmond Ridder time in Atlanta.
It may finally be time for a quarterback change. I'm Aaron Freeman, host of Locked On Falcons. We've been wanting it. We've been hoping for it. We've been asking for it for several weeks, and it may finally be Desmond Ridder time. The Falcons dropped another one in Week 13, losing 19-16 at home against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it feels like the culprit was a poor Marcus Mariota performance as well as an over-reliance on their passing game early, forcing the team into a 16-6 hole at halftime. And then once they recommitted to running the football in the second half, they were able to climb back into it, but it was too little too late. And unfortunately, Marcus Mariota's scatter shot accuracy didn't really help matters, finishing the game, completing just 54% of his passes. And when it came time for Mariota to lead the Falcons on a would-be comeback in the closing minute of the fourth quarter, his first pass was picked off by safety Minkah Fitzpatrick on a game-sealing interception. Head coach Arthur Smith said after the game that changes are imminent and that they'll be looking at everything during their upcoming bye week when it comes to the quarterback position. And this is a stark change from the past post-game rhetoric from Smith after poor Mariota performances. So we may finally be approaching Desmond Ridder time for more coverage of what the Falcons need to do to get their season back on track during this bye week. Follow Locked On Falcons, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Sometimes nobody wins after a hard-fought game, and those are perhaps the ones that are most difficult to deal with. Locked On Commanders and Locked On Giants go over the only tie from Sunday's NFL action.
Fit to be tied. All right, Washington Commanders fans, we're here at MetLife Stadium where the Washington Commanders head to the bye at 7-5-1. That's right, they did not lose, but they did not win. Here in East Rutherford, New Jersey, a 2020 NFC East tie with the New York Giants. The good news is they didn't lose. The bad news is it feels more like a loss than even a tie, if we're being honest. The Commanders had a 10-0 lead early on, really struggled in the middle 2 quarters of the game, then tied it up late on a Jahan Dotson 28-yard touchdown pass, catch, and run from Taylor Heineke, who had earlier, one play before, hit Curtis Samuel on a big gain to set up the Jahan Dotson touchdown, which was more Dotson than Heineke, but certainly the quarterback deserves credit for that game-tying drive. The Commanders kicked the extra point, had a chance in overtime after a 21-yard Curtis Samuel run brought them to the Giants side of the field, but then they stalled and couldn't even get a field goal attempt off. The Giants, they tried a 58-yard field goal at the buzzer of overtime from former Washington kicker Graham Gano. It fell way short, and again, the game ended in a 20-20 tie. For the Giants, they are now 7-4-1. Again, the Commanders 7-5-1. As they go to the bye, we'll have full reaction with David Harrison, who's also here with me at MetLife Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey, on the Locked On Commanders podcast on our Sunday night postgame Monday edition of LOC. For Locked On Now, I'm Chris Russell.
The New York Giants battled to a 20-20 tie with the Washington Commanders, but it might as well have been a loss given how the game unfolded. Hi, everybody. Patricia Traynor reporting. And the Giants have proven time and time again that this season that unless they play as pristine of a game as possible, they're just not going to win. And such was the case this week. New York spotted Washington 10 points before eventually tying it up at 13-13 at the half. But when the Giants took a 20-13 lead, they were unable to protect it. The Commanders coming roaring back to tie the game and force it into overtime, where neither team could finish off the other. But this wasn't solely on the Giants' defense, which played reasonably well, all things considered. The Giants' offense simply disappeared in the second half of the game, their final 4 drives in regulation netting them -8 yards of total offense. Ouch. And even in the overtime period, when they had a chance to snatch the victory by riding the strong leg of kicker Graham Gano, they fell short by about 5 yards or so of giving their kicker the best possible chance of playing the hero. So what's next? The Giants have a home date with the red-hot Eagles that people are already thinking will turn ugly. They then travel to Washington to face a Commanders team that will be coming off of its bye, and which by the time they take the field will have had 3 weeks to dissect every nook and cranny of the Giants' offense and defense. New York is still holding on to a playoff spot, even after this disappointing showing. But unless they figure out a way to overcome the hard knocks that this season has thrown their way with injuries and the like, that hold is going to slip away. For more on the New York Giants, keep it here on the Locked On Giants podcast.
Coming up, the 49ers get a win, but they lose another quarterback to a season-ending injury. This is Locked On Game to Game NFL. Today's edition of Locked On Game to Game is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's a super simple way to play daily fantasy sports. What you do is you pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money. And on any entry, you are not competing against anyone. You are just competing against those projections. So what you want to do is download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First time, you can receive a 100% deposit match of up to $100 when you use our promo code Locked On. So if you deposit $100, Prize Picks is going to give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. So don't forget to enter that promo code Locked On to sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. Welcome back to Locked On Game to Game NFL. I'm your host, Kainani Stevens. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every weekday. 49ers pulled off a win over the streaking Miami Dolphins, but they suffered a greater loss as Jimmy Garoppolo is going to miss the rest of the season due to a foot injury. Locked On 49ers has a lot to go over post-game.
The roller coaster ride never stops for the 2022 San Francisco 49ers. Hey, everybody, I'm Brian Peacock here from Locked On 49ers. And even in a huge 33-17 win, a measuring stick game for the San Francisco 49ers over the Miami Dolphins, clouded by injury. Jimmy Garoppolo, broken foot. Looks like he is going to be done for the season. They had to turn to Mr. Irrelevant, 7th-round rookie quarterback Brock Purdy, and it was all okay. The 49ers still rode their defense to victory here in this game. Nick Bosa, 14.5 sacks on the year, a couple of sacks in this one, putting together a Defensive Player of the Year season for the best defense in the National Football League. And if you didn't believe it, you got to start believing now after they hold the Dolphins, even with 2 big explosive plays in this game, long touchdowns, one of them by Tyreek Hill, still holding the Dolphins to 17 points and winning what looked pretty easily at the end on the scoreboard, even though it was tighter than it felt with a 33-17 score. Brock Purdy and the San Francisco 49ers offense doing enough to get the victory in this game. Purdy, 25 of 37, throwing for 210 yards, 1 interception, couple of touchdowns, some good throws, some bad throws, a lot to build on for the rookie quarterback. But in the end, played good enough for the 49ers to win if they keep playing this brand of defense, and he might have to keep playing quarterback for this team. We'll find out what happens at quarterback. Could Trey Lance come back? A ton of questions here on offense. Christian McCaffrey was the focal point for the Niners, carried the ball 17 times for 66 yards, another 10 targets, 8 catches for 80 yards, and a touchdown there. What's next for the San Francisco 49ers in this roller coaster of a season? I don't know, but it looks like a lot might hinge upon rookie 7th-round quarterback Brock Purdy. For more on your 2022 San Francisco 49ers, make sure you're tuned in and subscribed up to the Locked On 49ers podcast, available everywhere you get your podcasts.
In Deshaun Watson's return to Houston, the Texans could not muster up much of anything on offense. Locked On Texans definitely not impressed with what they saw on Sunday.
I don't know if it was Pep Hamilton calling the offense or if it was Pepe Le Pew. But all I know is the offense stunk on Sunday, which is why the Houston Texans lost 27-14 against the Cleveland Browns in Deshaun Watson's return. Kyle Allen, 201 yards, 1 late game touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Dameon Pierce had a better day than what he had in his past 2 outings, 73 yards on 18 carries, and he now has 1,000 scrimmage yards this year in his rookie year. Houston Texans, 4 costly turnovers, 1 of 12 on third downs. I do want to highlight Jalen Petrie. He had a very good game, 16 total tackles and 1 interception on Deshaun Watson. But the story of the game is how can you get down to the 1-yard line and not decide to give Dameon Pierce the ball in order to score? If Houston scores on a 1-yard line, then I think the total outcome of this game is completely different. Guys, be sure to check out the Locked On Texans throughout the week as we continue to discuss the Houston Texans offensive issues and whether or not it's time to immediately call for the job of the offensive coordinator, Pep Hamilton.
The Bengals get their biggest win of the season as they top the Chiefs 27-24. Locked On Bengals says this is a statement win for the defending AFC champs.
The Cincinnati Bengals are now 3-0 in their last 3 games against the Patrick Mahomes-led Chiefs. I'm Jake Lisco from the Locked On Bengals podcast, and the Bengals get a huge win on Sunday to go to 8-4 on the season, to keep the number 1 seed in play, and to announce to the entire NFL that they're here and they're not going anywhere after 2 straight wins against AFC teams likely to be contending in the playoffs, likely to win their divisions. The Bengals are sitting pretty themselves, keeping pace with the Ravens in the win-loss column and making a push, setting themselves up with a game against the Bills coming up to push for that 1 seed as well. This is where that needed to start, of course, and massive plays down the stretch for Jermaine Pratt, for Joseph Osai, for Samaje Perine, for T. Higgins, for Jamar Chase, and another masterful game from Joe Burrow helped them get there, doing just enough to contain the Chiefs at times, to force field goal attempts, and really overcoming some of their own mistakes. This game could have been even more lopsided in the Bengals' favor if not for a few key plays going the Chiefs' way. For more on the Cincinnati Bengals victory over the Chiefs and coverage for the rest of the year, make sure to check out the Locked On Bengals podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, where we'll be covering your team every day.
The Chargers fell to the Raiders in Vegas yesterday, and Locked On Chargers says Justin Herbert had no chance at getting anything done with so little protection from the offensive line.
Chargers quarterback Justin Herbert was running for his life in this one, and unfortunately the Chargers lose to the Raiders 27-20. This is David Drogemeyer of the Locked On Chargers podcast, and on offense for the Chargers, it was a struggle protecting Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert was sacked 5 times and under constant duress from the beginning of the game to the end of the game. And they couldn't run the football either, which, that didn't really help that. And on defense, the 2 guys that you could not allow to beat you was Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs, and they both went off. Devontae Adams, 177 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns, and Josh Jacobs, 144 rushing yards on the day. Those 2 guys did whatever they wanted, and the Chargers could not get enough stops. And on offense, when you don't get your first touchdown until the 4th quarter, it's going to be a really tough day. For the Chargers, they have to win out from here on out if they want a legitimate chance at making the playoffs. But for more on this game and for more on the Chargers, please check out the Locked On Chargers podcast, your team every day.
An early injury for Lamar Jackson turned the Denver-Baltimore game into a field goal contest until pretty late in the 4th. Locked On Ravens and Locked On Broncos have all the details.
The Denver Broncos lose in wash, rinse, repeat fashion against the Lamar Jackson-less Baltimore Ravens on Sunday. I'm Cody York, host of Locked On Broncos, and unfortunately the same story has played out for this Broncos team all season long. The defense has been their strong suit all year. And in a game where Lamar Jackson exited with a knee injury early on, Tyler Huntley came in and, he threw an interception early on, but he led a game-winning drive, a 16-play, 91-yard drive late in the game to give the Baltimore Ravens the lead here. Unfortunately, the Broncos defense couldn't get enough stops late when it mattered, despite having 2 takeaways and multiple sacks on the day. But the story continues to be the same for the offense as they fail to generate much momentum or plays or points this season. 110 points scored on the year. They are on pace for a historic low that was set by the Cleveland Browns with 161 total points scored in the 2000 season. Check out the Locked On Broncos post-game report for all the action of this latest Broncos loss to put them at 3-9 on the season, wherever you get your podcast in audio format or whether you watch on YouTube.
The Baltimore Ravens pull off another ugly win, this time against the Broncos in Week 13. I'm Kevin Allstrecker, the host of Locked On Ravens. The Ravens win 10-9 over Denver, but they still have a lot of things that they can work on coming out of this game. The offense sputtered for the majority of the day, both with and without Lamar Jackson. Jackson left the game in the first half with a knee injury. He was first deemed questionable, then downgraded to out. John Harbaugh said after the game that Jackson has a days to weeks type injury, so still undetermined how long he actually misses with the ailment, but the Ravens go 3 of 13 on third down. They don't convert again in the red zone. They go 1 of 2 in that area, but Tyler Huntley comes in, and while it wasn't pretty for the majority of the day, he did lead the Ravens when it mattered. A 16-play, 91-yard touchdown drive to give the Ravens the 10-9 lead, which ended up becoming the 10-9 victory. The Baltimore defense did their job against that Denver offense. 3 field goals, no touchdowns for that Denver offense. So the Ravens now stand at 8-4, still atop the AFC North Division with a Week 14 matchup with the Pittsburgh Steelers on the horizon. For more on the Ravens and their Week 13 win, be sure to follow the Locked On Ravens podcast and subscribe on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
That's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Game to Game. Thank you so much for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On NFL and your team's Locked On podcast on YouTube and wherever else you get your podcasts from. I'm Kanani Stevens. This has been Locked On Game to Game.